Hey, this is Professor Favors with American Literature. So, the discussion today is on Jack London's To Build a Fire. It is part of naturalism. So, previous lessons and lectures have been on romanticism, realism, political realism, and now we are going to get into naturalism. So, this is American Literature, Jack London's To Build a Fire. This discussion is subject to fair use. So let's discuss To Build a Fire, the human man's problem with judgment. Judgment could mean from a religious standpoint, judgment could be also from a personal standpoint, just personal judgment. All right, so turning from the standard trail, Date had broken cold and gray, exceedingly cold and gray, when the man turned aside from the main Yukon Trail and climbed the high earth bank, where a dim and little traveled trail led eastward through the fat spruce timberland. It was a steep bank, and he paused for breath at the top, excusing the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock. There was no sun nor hint of sun, though there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day. And yet there seemed an intangible pall over the face of things, a subtle gloom that made the day dark. And that was due to the absence of sun. This fact did not worry the man. He was used to the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun, and he knew that a few more days must pass before that cheerful orb due south would just peep above the skyline and dip immediately from view. One of the issues with just your own personal judgment is when you turn aside from the main trail. A lot of times, if you are running track, running on a field, running in an area where there's a running path, pay attention to when you actually run off that trail and what happens, how you are affected, how you're running, um, the running in even your legs is different. So when he turns off the trail from the main Yukon Trail, which is something that many people already take, it's everyone is very familiar with that trail. He's going to experience some setbacks, and we know that to be true because um, he was even though he was used to the lack of sun, there was still absence of sun. And so in certain areas, that's important if you're going to turn off the main side of the trail. A part of the human struggle is that sort of struggle with no self-assessment. So, but all this, the mysterious far-reaching hairline trail, the absence of sun from the sky, the tremendous cold, and the strangeness and weirdness of it all made no impression on the man. It was not because he was long used to it. He was a newcomer in the land, a Chekao, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things and not in the significances. 5 degrees below zero meant 80 odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature and upon man's frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold. And from there on, it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. 50 degrees below zero stood for a bite of frost that hurt and that must be guarded against by the use of mittens, ear flaps, warm moccasins, and thick soles. 50 degrees below zero was to him just precisely 50 degrees below zero. That there should be anything more to it was that was a thought that never entered his head. So he was not one for thinking about the significance of something. 50 degrees within an area that is largely already cold should have given him pause, given that he was a newcomer in the land. He not only does he go off the main trail, but he has also the added disadvantage that he's a newcomer in the land. He's not used to this particular type of area. He's not used to walking in the cold. Even though you can have mittens, you can have ear flaps, you can have warm moccasins, thick socks. You can If you're not used to this type of environment, it's going to affect you a lot differently, especially when you are walking the trail, walking off the main trail and you are walking it alone. So he may have been quick and alert in the things of life, but he didn't care about the significance of some of the decisions that he was making at this time. And so the thought that there should be anything more than the 50 degrees, that thought was never that never entered his head. So he has no real self-assessment. You can know something in life just generally, but every environment requires specific type of knowledge you need to know. Animal's instinct outweighs human reasoning. The animal was depressed by the tremendous cold. So we're talking about the dog companion that he's with. It knew that it was no time for traveling. Its instinct told it a truer tale than was told to the man by the man's judgment. In reality, it was not merely colder than 50 below zero, it was colder than 60 below, than 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Since the freezing point is 32 above zero, it meant that 107 degrees of frost obtained. The dog did not know anything about thermometers. Possibly in his brain there was no sharp consciousness of a condition of very cold, such as was in the man's brain. But the brute had its instinct. It experienced a vague but menacing apprehension that subdued it and made it slink along at the man's heels. And that made it question eagerly every unwanted movement of the man, as if expecting him to go into camp or to seek shelter somewhere and build a fire. The dog had learned fire and it wanted fire, or else to burrow under the snow and cuddle its warm away from the air. So the dog, in contrast to the human, has instinct. The dog has better instinct than the actual human does. So you would think that the human would have prepared better for the dog and for himself. No, um, the dog knows fire. In matter of fact, the dog is aware of fire, knows the timing of fire. He knows when his fair his body, his animal body, experiences some sort of coldness, that fire should accompany it. But for the human is not reasoning enough to build a fire. The dog had learned fire. It wanted fire. So the dog knew that fire existed. The man should know that fire existed. By the time you get to 75 below zero, it's time to build a fire. So the dog has more instinct in this situation than the animal has more instinct in this situation than the human, because the human is not exercising the best judgment in this situation. Fire should be at the uttermost of his mind. Pang of regret. So once in a while, the thought reiterated itself that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his cheekbones and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this automatically, now and again changing hands. But rub as he would, the instant he stopped, his cheekbones went numb, and the following instant the end of his nose went numb. He was sure to he was sure to frost his cheeks, he knew that, and experienced a pang of regret that he had not devised a nose trap of the sort Bud wore in cold snaps. Such a strap passed across the cheeks as well and saved them. But it didn't matter much after all. What were frosted cheeks? A bit painful, that was all. They were never serious. At 12:30 to the minute, he arrived at the forks of the creek. He was pleased at the speed he had made. If he kept it up, he would certainly be with the boys by 6. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and drew forth his lunch. The action consumed no more than a quarter of a minute. Yet in that brief moment the numbness laid hold of the exposed fingers. He had forgotten to build a fire and thaw out. He chuckled at his foolishness, and as he chuckled he noted the numbness creeping into the exposed fingers. That man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in the country, and he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. So with this particular character, uh, he has never ever experienced this type of cold, and the problem is that if you look at the beginning, that he had never experienced this type of cold, and that one must not be too sure of things. So again, you can know certain things about cold. There's a cold that you experience in the north. There's a cold you experience in the south. There's a cold you experience in the west and the east, and then there's definitely a different cold that you experience in the Midwest. And so just because your experiences with cold in one geography of the country, just because you experience that cold doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same kind of cold you are going to experience on the Yukon Trail, which is much closer. So he mocks the man who told him that he should have actually gone with a companion, and we'll see that later. And so he realizes at the beginning that he hasn't experienced this type of cold. The most important aspect of this that he doesn't understand is that he had forgotten to build a fire. He had forgotten to build a fire. If you're going to be in this type of cold, you need to have knowledge of this type of cold, for one. If you're going to be in this type of cold, you need to prepare well for this type of cold. Think about the cold as a metaphor for a career. If you're going to be in a certain kind of career, you need to prepare for that career. You need to have the knowledge, especially technical knowledge. You don't go into a career workforce environment just winging it. You don't go on the Yukon Trail, off the main trail, just winging it. It's a different type of cold. It's a different type of experience. So uh, he should have immediately thought that he needed to build a fire. That's the objective. If you're going to be on this type of trail in this type of cold, but he mocked the old man. Lack of knowledge. So this man did not know cold. Possibly all the generations of his ancestry had been ignorant of cold, of real cold, of cold 107 degrees below freezing point. But the dog knew. All its ancestry knew, and it had inherited the knowledge, and it knew that it was not good to walk abroad in such fearful cold. It was a time to lie snug in a hole in the snow and a certain wait for a certain of cloud to be drawn across the face of outer space whence this cold came. On the other hand, there was keen intimacy between the dog and the man. The one was the toil slave of the other, and the only caresses it had ever received were the caresses of the whiplash and of harsh and menacing throat sounds that threatened the whiplash. So the dog made no effort to communicate its apprehension to the man. It was not concerned in the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned back toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of whiplashes, and the dog swung in at the man's heels and followed after. So again, of course, this man did not know cold, but the dog knew. The dog knew. The dog's ancestry knew. The dog had inherited the knowledge, and the dog knew that it wasn't a good idea to walk abroad in such fearful cold. And so, what I thought was very interesting in this part, even though there's keen intimacy between the dog and the man, uh, The dog doesn't make any effort to communicate its apprehension to the man because they can't communicate with each other. There may be intimacy with the dog in terms of being a companion to each other, but when it comes down to it, the male character needs another male character. The male character needs uh, a direct companion, an equal companion, to help him in this particular journey, to help him on this journey. He can rely on the dog for whatever the dog can give him based upon the dog's ancestry. The dog does have knowledge. The dog knows. He has ancestry. He has inherited knowledge. But if the dog was a human, the dog could tell the man that this is not the code you should have come in. You should not have come to this type of code. But there was someone who was trying to give him this information and he refused. So we're going to see that now. Disregarded warnings. He knew there must be no failure. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his attempt to build a fire. That is, if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and restore his circulation. But the circulation of wet and freezing feet cannot be restored by running when it is 75 below. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze the harder. All this the man knew. The old timer on Sulphur Creek had told him about it the previous fall, and now he was appreciating the advice. Already all sensation had gone out of his feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mitten, and the fingers had quickly gone numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pumping blood to the surface of his body and to all the extremities. But the instant stopped, the action of the pump eased down. The cold of space smote the unprotected tip of the planet, and he, being on that unprotected tip, received the full force of the blow. He remembered the advice of the old timer on Sulphur Creek and smiled. The old timer had been very serious in laying down the law that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. Those old timers were rather womanish, some of them, he thought. All a man had to do was to keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone, but it was surprising the rapidity with which his cheeks and nose were freezing. So even though the man has received warnings about not traveling that particular area alone, we have here he's now appreciating the advice not because he finds it helpful, but because he knows the man the man's words are confirming what he's feeling, that he's feeling the effects of not being completely prepared for the journey. But even though he acknowledges the old timer had been very serious in laying down the law and that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below, here there is a bit of a mockery that he makes from here. You can see that he appreciates what he says in the bold, but now he's going to mock him. He calls him womanish, um, and then he says, "Yeah, okay, I get that you told me that I should have not traveled by myself, but all a man had to do was keep his head. He was all right. All he had to do is just keep the journey. Uh, and any man who was a man could travel alone. So now he puts it on a man level. He is in contrast to womanish, and he said, and so that means on some level he is accusing the old man of being womanish. The old timers were rather womanish. So they're too woman like. They wouldn't be able to walk the trail off the main trail after 50 below. But as a man, I could travel alone. I'm fine with it. So I don't know what he's talking about. Even though it's confirmed, it's just confirmed here that traveling alone has its disadvantages, he still is not willing to accept the warning. So here's the consequence of warnings. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault, or rather his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the spruce tree. He should have built it in the open. But it had been easier to pull the twigs from the brush and drop them directly on the fire. Now the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its boughs. This fell on the boughs beneath, capsizing them. This process continued, spreading out and involving the whole tree. It grew like an avalanche, and it descended without warning upon the man and the fire was blotted out. The man was shocked. It was as though he had just heard his own sentence of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Then he grew very calm. Perhaps the old timer on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had only had a trail mate, he would have been in no danger now. The trail mate could have built the fire. Well, it was up to him to build the fire over again, and this second time there must be no failure. Even if he succeeded, he would most likely lose some toes. His feet must be badly frozen by now, and there would be some time before the second fire was ready. So now he confirms. Perhaps the old timer was right. If he had only had a trail mate, he would have been in no danger. The trail mate could have built the fire. However, I don't believe he believes still that the warning was. I don't believe he really believes that. I think he's giving lip service. As you see, some people, anytime you're trying to talk to somebody and give them a warning, right, and they are nodding their head and say, "Okay, okay, I got it," right. I don't think they really have it, or I think they don't choose to get it. They're just being performative. In this way, he's being performative. He knows he's right. He knows he should have gotten a trail mate, but he said, "Well, it's up to him to build the fire over again." And this second time, there must be no failure. So I don't think he spends enough time really understanding the consequence of his warning. But of course, once you are in the situation, you don't have that much time, because he most likely lost some toes. He most likely is his feet are frozen by now, and that's what happens when you don't adhere appreciate warnings, because by the time you are in the situation, you can't really turn back. You can't really turn back the hands of time. And the consequences that you get are the consequences that you get. All right, fear and the need for survival. So the sight of the dog put a wild ideal into his head. He remembered the tale of the man caught in a blizzard who killed a steer and crawled inside the carcass, and so was saved. He would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until the numbness went out of them. Then he could build another fire. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal, who had never known the man to speak in such a way before. Something was the matter, and its suspicious nature sensed danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere, somehow, in its brain arose an apprehension of the man. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could get away, he encircled his body with his arms. He sat down in the snow, and in this fashion held the dog while it snarled and whined and struggled. He realized that he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. With his helpless hands he could neither draw nor hold his staff knife nor throttle the animal. He released it, and it plunged wildly away with tail between his legs and still snarling. This is what happens when you get off the main path and you experience consequences. And instead of accepting the fact that you should have planned better, you create a different plan. In this case, he's desperate. So he's thinking, well, if I just killed the dog, I can get warm. Versus had he prepared well before leaving to go onto the trail and already had what he needed to have to have warmth, he wouldn't have to kill the dog. And so, of course, he come to the understanding that he's not going to be able to kill the dog because the apprehension or the instinct from the dog understood. The dog is instinctual, so the dog understood that his voice was changing. It wasn't the same kind of changing. It wasn't the dog. Just remember a couple of slides before this. The dog and the man have a relationship in terms of they intimately know each other. They understand. They have walked together as animal and human, and so they know each other. So the dog is going to know. The dog is going to know the difference between the way the man speaks to him in a natural, normal, less apprehensive way, and when the man is speaking into him in a way that is sort of frightening for the animal. But he does come to the understanding that he cannot kill the dog. And so the dog has now they have developed a different relationship. The dog has to change his own instinct. Whatever instinct that he had towards the man as being of a companion to the man and support to the man, that is going to change. He's going to look at him just as suspiciously as if the man would look at the dog suspiciously if the dog had attacked him. All right, so chasing death, well, he was bound to freeze anyway, and he might as well take it decently. With this newfound peace of mind came the first glimmerings of drowsiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep off to death. It was like taking an anesthetic. Freezing was not so bad as people thought. There were lots worse ways to die. You were right, old hoss, you were right, the man mumbled to the old timer of Sulphur Creek. Then the man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. Later the dog whined loudly, and still later it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew, where were the other food providers and fire providers. Food and fire providers. So now we get a true appreciation of what the old timer said. We know that to be true because the character doesn't add a but. He doesn't say, he was right, but he doesn't do that. You know why? Because he has to sleep off to death. He's out of time. So he don't have the opportunity anymore to debate with the old timer, or to debate with the rules of life, or to debate with the consequences of life, or to debate with what he should have done. Like he's sleeping off to death, and the companion that he's with doesn't have time to. That companion senses death, the scent of death. So the companion again is operating in its instinct about death and what's going on with the man who is sleeping off to death. So then all the animal has to do is what he's going to do instinctually. Go up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew, because remember, the dog has knowledge. The dog has more knowledge than the man. Where the other food providers and fire providers are. So the dog goes on and lives this life because the dog is going to do what a dog is going to do. And so the dog in this particular case is not the wrong one. The dog has been working with instinct, has inherited knowledge about the situation. The dog knows the path. So therefore, that's why you see, you don't see in reading this that the dog sat next to the man and just laid with him. No, he understood that I have to go on with my life in a sense, and find the next food provider and the next five provider. But it is here that we know, and it's really a mumble. It's really a mumble that it's almost like he doesn't want to really admit it, but he has no choice. He done got to a point where he's now chasing death, and he has no choice but to agree to it. All right, so these are the works consulted for Jack London's Build a Fire, and then Naturalism. There's a definition of realism, naturalism, and then a Britannica entry for analysis of representation, Emile Zola. Then, of course, your resources on realism, Spanish American War, glossary of literary terms, writing for English courses, and then point of view from Merriam Webster's. Lastly, this is Jack London resources. So there is a Britannica entry for Jack London, American author. There's a biography for him as well. And then there is a bibliography, Jack London Online, Sonoma State University. So if you're interested in his work, if you visit this website here, london.sonoma.edu, it's a extremely long bibliography of works and critical works, scholarship, etc. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.